America has built some amazing cars, but also some of the dumbest machines ever to hit the road. Cars that looked cool in ads, but broke down constantly, handled like shopping carts, or were so poorly designed they became jokes. Some were unsafe, others unreliable, and a few were just plain ridiculous. These weren't just bad cars, they were disasters on wheels that made drivers regret every mile. Here are the 10 dumbest cars America has ever made, the ones that proved even the biggest car companies can make huge mistakes. The 1958 Ford Edsel stands as one of the most infamous and bewildering disasters in the history of the American automobile industry. When Ford unveiled it, the company genuinely believed it was launching the next great automotive dynasty, one that would bridge the gap between its mid-range Mercury line and the more luxurious Lincoln. Years of planning, millions of dollars in market research, and an almost prophetic level of hype surrounded its debut. Yet what arrived in showrooms in the fall of 1957 was a car that immediately became a laughingstock. A machine so badly received that its very name, Edsel, would forever become shorthand for corporate failure, arrogance, and the dangers of not understanding your audience. The concept behind the Edsel had, on paper, seemed brilliant. Executives had identified what they believed was an untapped segment of the market, buyers who wanted something fancier than a Ford but couldn't afford a Mercury. To capture this crowd, Ford invested an incredible $400 million, over $4 billion in today's money, to create not just a car, but an entire new brand, Edsel. It was named after Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's only son, in what was meant to be a gesture of respect. But almost immediately, the car's identity was mired in confusion. It wasn't clear who it was really for. The marketing promised futuristic design and revolutionary engineering, yet the product that rolled off the line was little more than a rebodied Ford or Mercury with eccentric styling, clunky controls, and a hefty price tag. The styling was the first thing that drew ridicule. Designed to look distinctive, the Edsel's front end featured a vertical, oval-shaped grille that quickly earned cruel nicknames from both the public and the press. Some called it the toilet seat, others the horse collar, and still others less polite anatomical terms. It was meant to stand out, but it stood out for all the wrong reasons. Many Americans found it ugly, strange, or downright embarrassing. The car's nameplates, badges, and trim were excessive, making it look fussy and over-designed compared to the clean, elegant lines of rivals like the Chevrolet Bel Air or the Plymouth Fury. Then there was the car's overly complicated engineering. One of its supposed innovations, the teletouch transmission, placed the gear selector buttons in the center of the steering wheel hub. This idea, while futuristic in theory, turned out to be a disaster in practice. Drivers often hit the wrong buttons while turning or found the system unresponsive. The mechanism was complicated, prone to electrical faults, and extremely costly to repair. Mechanics hated it, and customers quickly grew frustrated. Worse, the car was launched with numerous mechanical issues, from leaking seals to poor assembly quality, because Ford's factories were not properly prepared to build a whole new model line under such intense pressure. The Edsel also suffered from one of the worst cases of bad timing in automotive history. It was introduced during the late summer of 1957, right as America was sliding into a recession. Consumers were tightening their belts, buying smaller and cheaper cars. Compact, efficient imports like Volkswagen were beginning to make inroads into the American market, and the flashy, gas-guzzling Edsel seemed hopelessly out of step. Its price, between $2,500 and $3,500, was too high for Ford buyers and too low for Mercury buyers, leaving it stranded in a no-man's land of marketing.
Ford had spent years building anticipation, even concealing the car's appearance until its unveiling on E-Day, September 4, 1957. But the moment customers saw it, many turned away in disappointment or outright laughter. Dealers who had been promised a golden opportunity were left with showrooms full of unsold Edsels. Ford's marketing blitz, which included television specials, magazine spreads, and celebrity endorsements, only made the failure more visible. Customers mocked the car's name, appearance, and endless mechanical issues. Within 2 years, Ford's grand dream of a new marque was dead. The company produced fewer than 120,000 Edsels in total, far below expectations, and Ford's losses approached $250 million, one of the largest corporate losses in American business history at that time. To many within Ford, the Edsel's failure was not just a financial disaster but a psychological one. It became a symbol of how arrogance and overconfidence could destroy even the most powerful companies. Executives had ignored early focus groups that warned the design was too strange and that the market wasn't large enough for another mid-price brand. They believed they could create demand through marketing alone, a fatal mistake. Even Henry Ford II, who had personally approved the project, was left deeply embarrassed by its collapse. Yet, paradoxically, the Edsel's legacy has evolved with time. Today, it holds a peculiar fascination for collectors and historians. What was once a symbol of failure is now a sought-after artifact of 1950s American excess and optimism. Restored Edsels draw attention at car shows not for their performance or success, but because they embody one of the most dramatic corporate blunders in history. Owners of surviving Edsels often describe them with affection, noting that the cars themselves weren't truly terrible to drive. They were well-equipped, powerful, and comfortable if one could overlook their eccentric styling and teething problems. One owner of a restored 1958 Edsel Ranger once remarked, "It's a good car, just one that was born at the wrong time with the wrong face." That statement captures the essence of the Edsel's tragedy. It wasn't just a bad car, it was a misunderstood one, crippled by poor design choices and catastrophic timing. Today, the Edsel remains an enduring cautionary tale, not only for automakers, but for all companies tempted by overconfidence and marketing hype. It serves as a reminder that success in the automotive world isn't achieved through gimmicks or bold promises, but by understanding what people truly want and need. The 1958 Ford Edsel, in all its chrome-heavy, horse-colored glory, will forever be remembered as the car that promised the future but delivered a fiasco.
The 1971 Ford Pinto has gone down in history not merely as a bad car, but as one of the darkest chapters in American automotive ethics, a moment when corporate cost-cutting and human tragedy collided in horrifying fashion. On paper, the Pinto was supposed to be Ford's answer to the small, efficient imports that were rapidly eating into Detroit's market share. Volkswagen had the Beetle, Toyota had the Corolla, and Datsun had the 510. Nimble, reliable, fuel-efficient cars that resonated with post-1960s consumers worried about fuel prices and looking for practicality over power. Ford, desperate not to lose ground, rushed to produce a small, lightweight car that could sell for under $2,000 and weigh less than 2,000 pounds. The result was the Pinto, a stylish little coupe that looked modern and accessible but concealed a fatal design flaw so severe that it became synonymous with corporate negligence and human indifference. The story of the Pinto's creation was one of reckless haste. Ford's then president, Lee Iacocca, had declared the subcompact is the future and demanded the Pinto be developed in record time, just 25 months, less than half the usual cycle. That meant corners were cut everywhere. Engineers worked under pressure, knowing that delays were unacceptable. The car was meant to be light, cheap, and easy to produce, so everything was pared down to the minimum. Unfortunately, that included safety testing. The final layout placed the fuel tank behind the rear axle, a common design in that era,
but with dangerously little space between the tank and the rear bumper. In low-speed rear-end collisions, the tank could be punctured by bolts or crushed against the differential housing, spraying gasoline directly into the cabin area or onto the hot exhaust. And because cost-cutting had stripped the car of meaningful reinforcements, even a 20 or 30 mile-per-hour impact could turn the Pinto into a fireball. What made the Pinto infamous wasn't just that it exploded, it was that Ford knew. Internal documents later revealed that Ford engineers had discovered the flaw early in crash testing. They proposed a simple solution, adding a plastic shield or rubber bladder to protect the tank, costing roughly $11 per car. But when management ran the numbers, the bean counters concluded that paying out for potential deaths and injuries would be cheaper than recalling or redesigning the vehicle. A now notorious cost-benefit analysis placed the value of a human life at $200,000, estimating that 180 burn deaths, 180 serious injuries, and 2,100 burned vehicles would cost Ford less than $50 million, compared to $137 million to fix every Pinto. It was a cold calculation, one that perfectly captured the cynicism of corporate America in the 1970s. When this information became public, thanks to investigative journalists and later a landmark court case, the country was horrified. The Pinto quickly became a symbol of greed and moral decay, an example of what happens when profit is valued above human life. The phrase Pinto madness, used in a 1977 Mother Jones expose, crystallized the outrage. Pictures of burned-out wrecks and survivor testimonies spread across the media. Lawsuits poured in, and Ford's reputation plummeted. One of the most infamous cases involved a 1972 crash in Indiana, where a Pinto was rear-ended and burst into flames, killing 3 teenage girls. The subsequent trial, State of Indiana versus Ford Motor Company, marked the first time in American history that a corporation was charged with criminal homicide for a vehicle design flaw. Although Ford was ultimately acquitted, the damage to its image was irreversible. Mechanically, the Pinto wasn't particularly awful by the standards of its time. It came with a modest 1.6-liter or 2.0-liter four-cylinder engine, offering around 75 to 100 horsepower depending on the version. It was light, easy to park, and reasonably fuel-efficient. But the ride was harsh, the interior Spartan, and the build quality inconsistent. Owners complained of rattles, leaks, and cheap materials. Worse, its body was so thin and unreinforced that in accidents of any kind, front, side, or rear, the occupants stood little chance. Safety wasn't just inadequate, it was practically non-existent. The dashboard and steering column were rigid, the doors had no side beams, and the windshield could shatter into dangerous shards. What had been designed as a car for young, budget-conscious Americans ended up endangering the very people it was meant to serve. The Pinto became more than just a defective car. It became a moral lesson. It forced the public to confront the ethics of corporate decision-making and helped spark a movement toward modern automotive safety standards. In the years that followed, federal crash regulations tightened, fuel systems were redesigned, and automakers learned that ignoring safety could cost far more than fixing it, both financially and reputationally. The case also helped inspire the creation of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's stricter recall powers and fuel system integrity standards. Even decades later, the Pinto's name remains radioactive. Though collectors sometimes restore them for curiosity's sake, the car's legacy is one of shame. It stands as a rolling monument to what happens when haste, greed, and negligence intersect. One owner, reflecting on his family's 1973 Pinto, recalled, "It was a cute little thing, but every time I saw one in the papers burned out on the highway, I wondered if we were just lucky." Another added, "You could fix the carburetor, you could fix the brakes, but you couldn't fix fear." Everyone knew about the gas tanks. In the end, the Pinto was not just a car. It was a turning point. It burned more than fuel, it burned trust. It reminded an entire generation that automobiles, for all their promise of freedom and progress, could also embody the worst of industrial arrogance. The Pinto might have been small and cheap, but its consequences were enormous, a cautionary tale written in fire and smoke on the highways of 1970s America.
The 1975 AMC Pacer was one of the strangest cars ever to emerge from Detroit. A vehicle that tried to reinvent the compact car for a new era, but ended up as a rolling punchline. When it debuted, the Pacer looked like nothing else on the road. It was wide, round, and filled with glass, a futuristic vision of the 1980s imagined through the tinted optimism of the 1970s. American Motors Corporation, the smallest of Detroit's Big Four, poured its dwindling resources into the Pacer, believing it would revolutionize small car design and save the company from extinction. What they built instead was a fascinating, ambitious, and deeply flawed automobile that became both a cult curiosity and a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to be too different too soon. When AMC began designing the Pacer in the early 1970s, the auto industry was in turmoil. The 1973 oil crisis had changed American driving habits overnight. Gasoline was suddenly expensive, and the small, efficient imports from Japan and Europe were dominating sales. AMC, which had always specialized in compact cars, saw an opportunity to leap ahead of the Big Three by creating something revolutionary. A small car with big car comfort, futuristic styling, and cutting-edge technology. Their engineers imagined a space-efficient car that would feel roomy inside but compact outside, and they even planned for it to use a rotary, Wankel engine, being developed by General Motors. The Pacer, they believed, would be the car of the future, aerodynamic, comfortable, and advanced. The resulting design was unlike anything America had ever seen. The Pacer's body was almost half glass, with enormous curved windows and a massive windshield that wrapped around like an aircraft canopy. The doors were huge, the roofline low and rounded, and the cabin surprisingly wide, nearly as wide as a full-size Cadillac. Inside, the Pacer was airy and comfortable, with plush seats and excellent visibility. AMC proudly marketed it as the first wide small car, a phrase that summed up both its brilliance and its absurdity. It was a small car in length, but not in girth. It looked compact from the front, but bloated from the side. Critics soon began calling it the fishbowl, the pregnant guppy, and even the flying terrarium. It was, without question, one of the most visually distinctive cars of the decade, but not necessarily in a good way. The original plan had been for the Pacer to use a lightweight, efficient rotary engine that would have suited its futuristic image perfectly. But when General Motors abruptly canceled its rotary program due to fuel economy and emissions issues, AMC was left stranded. They had already designed the entire car around the smaller rotary engine, so when they had to substitute a conventional inline-six instead, disaster struck. The engine barely fit under the hood, throwing off the car's balance and weight distribution. Worse, it was thirsty and underpowered. Despite being marketed as a compact car, the Pacer's fuel economy was miserable, often below 15 miles per gallon, making it a poor choice during the height of the fuel crisis. It was heavy, sluggish off the line, and awkward to drive. The six-cylinder engine strained under the car's weight, and even AMC's optional 304 cubic inch V8 failed to turn it into a performer. Drivers quickly discovered that the Pacer's futuristic styling came with practical drawbacks. The huge glass panels turned the interior into a greenhouse on sunny days, making it unbearably hot even with air conditioning. Its enormous doors were difficult to open in tight parking spaces, and repairing the car's unique body panels was a nightmare for mechanics. The visibility was excellent. You could see everything except your dignity, as one owner later joked. But the shape trapped heat, wind noise, and condensation in equal measure. Maintenance was expensive, and parts were often hard to find. The Pacer's odd proportions and bubble-like silhouette made it an instant target for ridicule. Car and Driver called it a car that looks like it's melting, while Road and Track described it as a transportation pod for people from another planet. The public's initial curiosity turned into mockery almost overnight. AMC had hoped to sell 300,000 Pacers a year, but sales peaked at around 145,000 in 1975 and collapsed rapidly thereafter. By 1979, the car was gone, and AMC was teetering on bankruptcy. The Pacer's failure became symbolic of the company's slow demise, a car that tried to predict the future, but misread the present. Yet, over the decades, the Pacer has achieved something remarkable. It has become beloved in its own bizarre way. Its unmistakable shape, once mocked, now makes it a nostalgic icon of the 1970s excess and ambition. When Wayne's World hit theaters in 1992, the blue and flame Pacer that Wayne and Garth rocked out in to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody suddenly made the car cool again, at least ironically. Collectors today prize well-preserved Pacers as symbols of the era's optimism and audacity, while design historians have come to appreciate AMC's courage in building something so radical on such a small budget. Many owners who have restored Pacers speak of them with a kind of affectionate amusement. "You don't buy a Pacer to blend in," said one collector from California. "You buy it because it's weird, it's honest, and it makes people smile." Another owner added, "It's like driving a joke that you're in on. You know it's ridiculous, but that's part of the fun." In the end, the 1975 AMC Pacer represents both the best and worst of 1970s American innovation. It was imaginative, original, and undeniably bold. But it was also poorly executed, mismarketed, and mechanically outdated before it even hit the road. AMC's dream of the future turned into a fishbowl of irony, a car that burned up in the sun of its own glassy ambition. It may not have saved AMC, but the Pacer remains unforgettable, a shimmering bubble of automotive history that still reflects the daring, eccentric spirit of its doomed creators.
The 1982 Cadillac Cimarron remains one of the most painful embarrassments in the long and storied history of General Motors. A cautionary tale of arrogance, panic, and corporate blindness wrapped in a flimsy layer of luxury trim. Conceived during a time when GM was scrambling to respond to the influx of efficient European and Japanese imports, the Cimarron was meant to usher Cadillac into a new era of compact, fuel-efficient luxury. Instead, it nearly destroyed the brand's reputation. It was a Cadillac in name only, a thinly disguised Chevrolet Cavalier with a fancy badge, some leather upholstery, and a price tag that insulted loyal Cadillac buyers. In one stroke, GM managed to alienate its traditional clientele, confuse its target market, and create what many critics still call the worst car Cadillac ever built. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Detroit was in crisis. The oil embargoes had shattered America's love affair with gas-guzzling land yachts, and consumers were turning towards smaller, more efficient European cars like BMWs, Audis, and Mercedes-Benzes. Cadillac executives watched in dismay as their once dominant luxury market began to shift toward these nimble, high-quality imports. The company realized it needed something smaller and more economical, something that could compete with the likes of the BMW 3 Series. Unfortunately, instead of developing a true luxury compact from scratch, GM decided to take a shortcut. The company had just launched a new platform, the J-Body, which underpinned the budget-friendly Chevrolet Cavalier. GM's leadership believed that by dressing it up with Cadillac trimmings, they could pass it off as a Euro-style luxury sedan. Thus, the Cimarron was born, a cynical exercise in badge engineering that fooled no one. When the Cimarron debuted for the 1982 model year, Cadillac's marketing tried to paint it as a bold departure, a new class of Cadillac designed for a changing world. But the illusion fell apart the moment anyone looked closely. Beneath the Cadillac crest and the veneer of wood grain lay the unmistakable bones of a low-end Chevy. The Cimarron shared its body, its interior architecture, and even its engine, a wheezy 1.8-liter inline-4 that produced a paltry 88 horsepower with the humble Cavalier. It was slow, underpowered, and struggled to maintain highway speeds with any sense of refinement. Reviewers found it noisy and coarse, with a transmission that hunted endlessly for gears.
Acceleration was glacial, taking nearly 15 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour, and the suspension, tuned for comfort, made handling floaty and uncertain. It was, in every sense, an economy car wearing a tuxedo made of cheap fabric. Inside, Cadillac's attempt to disguise the Cimarron's true nature was equally unconvincing. The dashboard, gauges, and switchgear were lifted almost directly from the Cavalier with only minor alterations. Cadillac added some leather upholstery, fake wood grain, and a few luxury touches, such as a better stereo and optional automatic climate control, but nothing could hide the car's economy car roots. Even the door panels and steering wheel felt flimsy, betraying the cost-cutting that defined the car's creation. Priced at nearly $13,000, roughly double the cost of a Cavalier, the Cimarron was not only disappointing, but outrageously overpriced. Customers expecting Cadillac's signature refinement and quietness were stunned by the car's mediocrity. One disgusted buyer was famously quoted as saying, "I bought a Cadillac, but I got a Chevy with lipstick." The automotive press was merciless. Car and Driver called it a cynical exercise in marketing, while Motor Trend labeled it a disgrace to the Cadillac name. Even GM insiders knew it was a mistake. Years later, one senior executive famously admitted, "All we did was take a Cavalier and stick a Cadillac badge on it. I wish we hadn't done it." Another said bluntly, the Cimarron eroded decades of Cadillac prestige overnight. Indeed, the damage to the brand was immense. Cadillac had built its reputation on big, powerful, opulent cruisers like the Eldorado and the Fleetwood, symbols of American luxury. To see that same crest pasted onto a car that could barely keep up with a Toyota Corolla was, to many loyal customers, a betrayal. The Cimarron did receive minor updates over its 6-year production run. GM eventually added a slightly larger 2.0-liter engine and optional V6, along with cosmetic tweaks and better trim. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Sales were dismal from the start, barely 25,000 units in its best year, and they dropped sharply thereafter. Cadillac quietly killed the Cimarron after 1988, and few mourned its passing. By that time, the car had become shorthand for everything wrong with GM's corporate philosophy in the 1980s. Complacency, lack of vision, and the belief that customers wouldn't notice the difference between true luxury and a cheap imitation. Despite its failure, the Cimarron remains fascinating as a historical artifact, a symbol of how hubris and panic can derail even a legendary brand. Some collectors today preserve them as oddities, reminders of Cadillac's lowest point. Ironically, a few owners grown fond of their Cimarrons, seeing them as misunderstood relics. One enthusiast once remarked, "It's the car everyone loves to hate, but at least it tried to bring Cadillac into a new era. It just took the wrong road." In retrospect, the 1982 Cadillac Cimarron wasn't just a bad car, it was a betrayal of identity. It represented the moment when Cadillac, in its desperate rush to chase trends, forgot what made it special. The Cimarron tried to be everything at once, economical, sporty, luxurious, but ended up being none of them. It remains one of the most notorious examples of badge engineering gone wrong, a luxury car in name only that diluted one of the proudest names in American motoring. Even today, when car historians speak of great automotive blunders, the Cimarron's name still hangs in the air, a whispered warning from a time when Cadillac forgot how to be Cadillac.
The 1979 Oldsmobile diesel stands as one of the most infamous engineering blunders in American automotive history. A car that didn't just fail mechanically, but managed to destroy an entire market segment for decades. Born from panic and corporate arrogance during the energy crisis, it was supposed to be GM's great answer to rising fuel prices and the success of efficient European diesels from Mercedes-Benz and Peugeot. Instead, it became a rolling catastrophe. By the early 1980s, its name alone was enough to make car buyers wince. What began as a bold idea to bring diesel economy to American luxury cars ended in clouds of black smoke, broken engines, lawsuits, and a legacy of distrust that still haunts Detroit's reputation with diesels to this day. To understand how the Oldsmobile diesel disaster happened, you have to remember the late 1970s. Gasoline prices had spiked after the oil embargoes, and American consumers were furious. Suddenly, efficiency mattered more than horsepower.
Diesel engines were known for their economy and durability. Europeans were driving them by the millions. Mercedes diesels were earning a reputation for running 500,000 miles without complaint, and GM wanted a piece of that market. But instead of taking the time to design a purpose-built diesel engine from scratch, General Motors made a fateful decision. They would take their existing 350 cubic inch Oldsmobile gasoline V8, modify it to run on diesel fuel, and rush it to production. It was a decision made by accountants, not engineers, and the result was catastrophic. The problems began deep inside the block. Diesel engines require massive internal strength because of their high compression ratios, often more than double that of gasoline engines. GM's engineers tried to adapt the existing Olds gas block by reinforcing it slightly, but it was nowhere near strong enough. The head bolts stretched under pressure, leading to blown head gaskets. The crankshafts cracked, the piston rings wore out prematurely, and the cylinder heads warped from the stress. The high compression also exposed every weakness in GM's machining tolerances, causing leaks and internal damage. To make matters worse, GM used standard gasoline engine head bolts rather than stronger ones needed for diesel duty, a cost-cutting move that doomed the engines before they even left the factory. When the 1979 Oldsmobile diesel debuted, GM was eager to sell it across its divisions. You could order a diesel in a Cadillac, a Buick, a Pontiac, or an Oldsmobile, and on paper, it sounded perfect. Big American comfort with European fuel economy. But owners soon discovered the truth. The engines were unbelievably unreliable. They smoked heavily, leaked oil, refused to start in cold weather, and emitted a clattering noise that made even loyal GM buyers cringe. One journalist at the time joked that you could always tell an Oldsmobile diesel owner by the cloud of gray despair following behind. Within just a few thousand miles, engines were blowing head gaskets, warping, or seizing entirely. Dealers were overwhelmed with warranty claims. Some cars failed before reaching 30,000 miles, an unthinkable scenario for a diesel engine, which was supposed to last forever. Many owners thought they could rely on the famous Oldsmobile durability of the 1960s, but instead found themselves stranded on highways with dead engines and huge repair bills. And because GM hadn't trained enough mechanics to repair them, most dealerships simply replaced entire engines, sometimes multiple times for the same customer. The bad news spread like wildfire. Lawsuits poured in from angry owners, and even GM's most loyal customers swore off the brand. In 1981, a class action lawsuit was filed that forced GM to extend warranties and cover many repairs, but the damage was already done. The American public associated diesel with disaster. Even drivers who never owned one started to believe diesel cars were slow, dirty, unreliable, and not worth the risk. For years afterwards, no American automaker could sell a diesel passenger car in significant numbers. GM's careless rush to market had effectively poisoned the well for everyone. The Oldsmobile diesel also suffered from compatibility issues with fuel. American diesel fuel at the time was often contaminated with water or poorly refined, and these engines lacked proper fuel-water separators. The result, fuel system corrosion, injector pump failures, and contaminated injectors that made the engines misfire violently. In cold climates, they were nearly impossible to start. Drivers in northern states joked that you could freeze to death waiting for an Olds diesel to crank. Even glow plugs failed regularly, leaving many owners stuck with cars that simply wouldn't start until the weather warmed up. Performance was another humiliation. Despite being a big 5.7-liter V8, the engine made a pathetic 120 horsepower and barely 220 pound-feet of torque. Acceleration was glacial, and on the highway, these massive sedans struggled to keep up with traffic. Cadillac buyers in particular were furious that their luxury cars sounded like dump trucks. One frustrated owner wrote into a magazine saying, "I paid Cadillac money for something that sounds like a dump truck and drives like a funeral procession." By the early 1980s, GM was quietly trying to improve the design, adding stronger head bolts, redesigned gaskets, and eventually a smaller 4.3-liter version. But it was too late. The reputation of the diesel Oldsmobile was beyond repair. By 1985, GM had pulled the plug entirely, and diesel passenger cars disappeared from American showrooms almost overnight. The words diesel and Oldsmobile became punchlines, symbols of failure. Today, the 1979 Oldsmobile diesel is remembered not just as a bad car, but as a moment that changed public perception. It didn't just destroy GM's credibility, it nearly killed diesel technology in the US for an entire generation. While European diesels continued to evolve into clean, efficient machines, Americans remembered the smoking, clattering, unreliable beasts that GM had unleashed. Even decades later, when manufacturers like Volkswagen and Mercedes tried to reintroduce diesel cars, they had to fight against the lingering ghost of the Oldsmobile diesel's reputation. For collectors, these cars now exist mostly as curiosities, symbols of a colossal miscalculation. A few survivors remain, often owned by enthusiasts who view them as fascinating relics of GM's darkest hour. One such owner once joked that, "It's the perfect collector car. It looks great, it smells like disaster, and everyone at the car show has a horror story about one."
The 1957 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham was perhaps the most extravagant, over-engineered, and self-destructive monument to American automotive luxury ever built. A gleaming, chrome-plated warning of what happens when technology outpaces practicality. Priced higher than a Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, the Brougham was Detroit's attempt to prove that Cadillac could outshine not only every rival in America, but every prestige brand in the world. What resulted was a car so advanced, so packed with innovation, and so breathtakingly beautiful that it looked like it had driven straight out of a science fiction dream. But beneath that shimmering skin lay a mechanical nightmare of fragile systems, electrical gremlins, and ceaseless maintenance woes. It was luxury without limits, and reliability without mercy. When it debuted in 1957, the Eldorado Brougham was supposed to represent the future of motoring. It was Cadillac's personal flagship, hand-built in limited numbers and intended for the kind of people who didn't just want to show wealth, they wanted to display technological supremacy. At $13,074, it cost more than a new home in many parts of America, and nearly double the price of a top-of-the-line Lincoln or Chrysler Imperial. Only the Rolls-Royce and the Mercedes 300 SL cost more. But what buyers got for that astronomical price was an engineering spectacle. Every inch of the car was meant to dazzle. Stainless steel roof, suicide rear doors, magnetic door catches, memory seats, and one of the first air suspension systems ever fitted to an American car. Even the vanity kit in the glove compartment came with a gold-plated comb, perfume atomizer, lipstick case, and a mirror with a silk pouch. Small luxuries that hinted at Cadillac's belief that the Brougham wasn't just a car, but an experience. Under the hood, the Eldorado carried Cadillac's 365 cubic inch V8, rated at 325 horsepower, a huge figure for 1957. It was smooth, silent, and powerful, capable of propelling the massive sedan past 115 miles per hour, which was astonishing for something weighing over 2 tons. On paper, it was the pinnacle of American engineering, but what looked like perfection soon unraveled in the real world. Cadillac's ambitious engineers had crammed the Brougham full of experimental systems that hadn't been tested long enough for durability. The air suspension, for example, was a marvel when new. It promised a magic carpet ride, automatically adjusting ride height to keep the car level regardless of load. In practice, it was a constant disaster. The rubber air bladders leaked, the compressor failed, and the control valves froze. Within months of ownership, many Broughams were sitting low on their haunches like wounded animals, unable to rise off the ground. Dealerships struggled to repair the air systems, often replacing them multiple times. Eventually, many frustrated owners had their cars converted to conventional coil springs just to keep them drivable. The same went for the self-closing trunk and the automatic door mechanisms, both of which relied on delicate solenoids and sensors that could fail without warning. Owners would press a button to close the trunk, only for it to jam halfway or refuse to open at all. The self-adjusting memory seats frequently lost their calibration, moving on their own or refusing to move at all.
Even the electric window mechanisms could malfunction if the car sat too long, leaving passengers trapped with the windows halfway open. It was, in essence, a brilliant but temperamental showpiece. Cadillac had built machines so advanced that it required the kind of maintenance and precision care only available in a laboratory, not a 1950s garage. And yet, despite its flaws, there was no denying its beauty. The Brougham's design was breathtaking, long, low, and elegant, with a stainless steel roof that gleamed like a polished mirror and a grille that seemed to float above the chrome-laden bumper. The suicide rear doors added a sense of theater, and the tail fins, while smaller than later Cadillacs, hinted at the jet-age optimism that would soon define the brand. Inside, everything was trimmed in the finest materials available: genuine leather, brushed aluminum, deep pile carpeting, and every switch, button, and control felt like something from a luxury spaceship. But even the wealthiest buyers soon learned that beauty can't compensate for constant breakdowns. Celebrities and executives who had paid Rolls-Royce money for their new Cadillacs found themselves stranded, embarrassed, and frustrated. Service visits were endless. Some owners returned their cars outright. Others quietly hid their Broughams in garages, unwilling to face the humiliation of admitting that their ultra-luxury Cadillac was a lemon. One former owner famously quipped, "It was like owning a Hollywood starlet, stunning to look at, impossible to live with." The financial impact was as brutal as the mechanical one. Cadillac lost money on every single Brougham built. Hand-assembling each car was slow, inefficient, and required a team of highly skilled workers. With only about 400 cars produced in 1957 and a similar number in 1958, the program was doomed from the start. By 1959, Cadillac shifted production of the Eldorado Brougham to Italy's Pininfarina in a desperate attempt to reduce costs. But even that failed to save it. The Brougham had simply become too expensive, too fragile, and too complicated to justify. Today, surviving 1957 Eldorado Broughams are prized collector's items, not because they were good cars, but because they represent a moment in history when Detroit dared to dream without limits. They were the embodiment of 1950s American confidence, that belief that anything was possible if you added enough chrome, horsepower, and electric switches. For collectors, restoring one today is an act of love and insanity. Finding original air suspension parts or electronic components is nearly impossible, and most restorations quietly replace the air system with modern alternatives just to make the car drivable. But when a Brougham is properly restored, few cars on Earth can match its sheer presence. Park one next to a contemporary Rolls or Bentley, and the Cadillac still looks like the future. The 1957 Eldorado Brougham stands both as a triumph and a tragedy. It was Cadillac at its most daring, a car that proved America could build something more sophisticated than any European rival, but also a sobering reminder that ambition without reliability leads to ruin. Its story is one of brilliance undone by its own excess. In the end, the Brougham wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of the American dream itself, beautiful, ambitious, and always one step away from breaking down.
The 1976 Chevrolet Chevette is one of those cars that time hasn't so much forgotten as it has deliberately tried to erase from memory. Born out of panic and corporate desperation, the Chevette was General Motors' rushed attempt to fight off the rising tide of small, efficient, and well-built Japanese imports that were taking over the American market in the mid-1970s. Unfortunately, instead of learning from the likes of Toyota and Honda, GM decided to build its own subcompact by cutting every possible corner. The result was a car that was cheap, slow, crude, and astonishingly disposable. A car that somehow managed to represent everything wrong with Detroit's response to the oil crisis. When it debuted in 1976, the Chevette was marketed as a simple, practical, fuel-efficient solution for American families. It was supposed to be the people's car of the post-gasoline shock era, light, economical, and easy to repair. But in reality, the Chevette was a rolling apology. Its engineering dated back to the early 1970s Opel Kadett, a European design that GM hastily adapted for the American market. By the time the Chevette arrived, it already felt old, like a relic from another decade. Under the hood sat a 1.6-liter inline-4 that wheezed out a pathetic 60 horsepower, struggling to move the car's 2,100-pound body. Acceleration from 0 to 60 miles per hour took around 18 seconds, and merging onto the freeway required both patience and prayer. The Chevette's performance was so underwhelming that even GM's advertising tried to spin it as honest and practical rather than fast or fun. But honesty was the problem. The Chevette's flaws were impossible to hide. The ride was rough, the handling vague, and the steering light enough to make the car feel unstable at highway speeds. It cornered like a shopping cart with one bad wheel, wobbling and leaning dangerously. The braking distances were long, and the suspension geometry made every bump or pothole feel like a small explosion beneath the floorboards. Owners often joked that the Chevette didn't so much drive as it shuffled down the road, bouncing and squeaking the whole way. Inside, the experience was even worse. The interior looked like it had been designed by accountants rather than engineers. Every surface was hard, brittle plastic or cheap vinyl that cracked and peeled within a few years. The dashboard was a flat, joyless expanse of gray, and the seats offered about as much support as a lawn chair. Sound insulation was minimal, so at highway speeds, the cabin was filled with the buzzing of the engine, the whining of the transmission, and the occasional rattle of loose panels. Even the heating and ventilation controls were primitive, often requiring both hands to adjust. There was no pretense of luxury, comfort, or innovation, just the bare minimum needed to call it a car. Rust, however, was the Chevette's greatest enemy. The body panels were thin and poorly protected, and within 2 or 3 winters, many cars began to rust through at the wheel arches, doors, and even floor pans. In the northern states, entire sections of Chevettes disintegrated before the loans were even paid off. Mechanics called them pre-rusted at the factory. One owner famously quipped, "I didn't trade in my Chevette, I swept it up." Even the mechanical parts didn't inspire confidence. The carburetors were temperamental, the transmissions notchy, and the electrical systems were notoriously unreliable. If the rust didn't destroy the car, the wiring probably would. Yet, despite all of this, the Chevette sold. In fact, it sold surprisingly well, not because people loved it, but because they had no better choice. The 1970s were a bleak time for American small cars, and the Chevette's simplicity and low price were its only real virtues. It was one of the cheapest new cars you could buy in America, and for drivers just trying to get from point A to point B without spending a fortune, that was enough. GM sold nearly 3 million Chevettes over its production run, proving that necessity can sometimes triumph over taste. It became the default car for first-time buyers, students, and those who couldn't afford anything else, a car that people drove out of desperation rather than desire. For those who actually owned one, the memories are often tinged with frustration and reluctant humor. Many recall the Chevette as a survivor car, not because it was durable, but because they somehow managed to survive driving it. Owners complained of constant stalling, vapor lock in hot weather, freezing carburetors in cold weather, and electrical shorts that caused headlights to flicker randomly. Others joked that the Chevette's greatest safety feature was its slowness. It couldn't go fast enough to hurt anyone in a crash. Still, for all its mediocrity, the Chevette holds a strange place in automotive history. It wasn't a good car by any measure, but it was a cultural snapshot of an America struggling to adapt. It represented the end of Detroit's arrogance, the moment when the Big Three realized that they could no longer sell garbage simply by attaching a familiar badge to it. The Chevette was GM's confession of defeat to the Japanese and European automakers that were building smaller, better, and far more reliable cars.
Today, the Chevrolet Chevette survives mostly as a punchline or a curiosity at obscure car shows. A few enthusiasts restore them out of nostalgia, not because they were good, but because they remind people of simpler, if more frustrating times. It was a car that tried to save GM from the imports, but ended up symbolizing the exact reason they were needed. The Chevette may have been cheap, slow, and ugly, but in its own sad way, it told a truth about 1970s America. Sometimes survival is the only success left.
The 1980 Chevrolet Citation is a classic example of ambition disastrously mismatched with execution, a car that promised revolution but delivered chaos, helping cement General Motors' reputation as a company struggling to adapt to the realities of the modern automotive world. Introduced as GM's first true front-wheel drive compact designed in-house, the Citation was supposed to be the company's bold answer to fuel-efficient, reliable imports from Japan and Europe. GM positioned it as a revolutionary vehicle, lightweight, efficient, and technologically forward-looking, capable of restoring confidence in Detroit after years of mediocre subcompacts and escalating criticism from savvy consumers. Instead, it became a textbook case of how not to design, engineer, or manufacture a car, leaving a trail of mechanical failures, recalls, and frustrated owners. At launch, the Citation was sold as part of GM's X-Body platform, which it shared with the Buick Skylark, Pontiac Phoenix, and Oldsmobile Omega. While front-wheel drive was relatively new for American manufacturers, GM hyped it as a leap into the future, better handling, more interior space, and improved fuel efficiency. The Citation's sleek hatchback design and aerodynamic sheet metal made it look modern and competitive against Volkswagen, Honda, and Toyota, promising the style-conscious buyer a European-like experience without leaving the comfort of the U.S. market. However, the reality behind the glossy exterior was far less promising. Mechanically, the Citation suffered from an astonishing array of problems. The brakes were notoriously weak and prone to fade under stress, making stopping distances unpredictable. Owners reported severe issues with the car's front-wheel drive transaxle, which tended to slip or fail entirely, especially under heavy acceleration or in hot weather. Steering was vague and inconsistent, sometimes pulling the car to one side without warning, raising safety concerns that compounded the mechanical unreliability. To make matters worse, the engine, a small 2.5-liter four-cylinder, was underpowered, struggling to propel the car's nearly 2,800-pound body. The combination of soft brakes, heavy weight, and uneven steering made the Citation feel unstable in emergency maneuvers, with many drivers likening it to a boat drifting through traffic, rather than a responsive compact car. Build quality only worsened the situation. Components rattled and fell off with alarming frequency. Dashboard switches would break, seat tracks would jam, and window regulators failed, leaving owners stranded with inoperable glass. Rust became a severe problem almost immediately, as the body panels were thin and poorly treated, and corrosion often appeared long before the bumper-to-bumper warranty expired. In colder climates, fenders, doors, and floor pans would deteriorate so rapidly that some cars were considered unsafe after only a few years. Many owners recalled finding rust forming around the wheel wells or under the doors before the car even reached 50,000 miles, an astonishing failure for a supposedly modern American compact. The Citation's problems were amplified by the sheer number of cars GM produced and sold. At the time, GM expected the Citation to be a game-changer for the company, and initial sales were strong, topping 800,000 units in its first year. But as more owners experienced brake failures, transmission slips, steering problems, and premature rust, complaints and lawsuits mounted. By the mid-1980s, the Citation had become one of the most recalled vehicles in GM history, with a list of defects that spanned brakes, steering, transmissions, body panels, and even electrical systems. Owners complained bitterly in newspapers and on consumer advocacy programs, with one calling it the car that wouldn't behave no matter how gently you drove it. The Chevrolet Citation's legacy was so damaging that it became shorthand for Detroit's decline in the face of rising Japanese and European competition. Cars like the Toyota Corona, Datsun B210, and Honda Accord offered superior engineering, reliability, and fuel efficiency, highlighting just how far GM had fallen behind in both design and quality control.
What was meant to showcase American innovation instead became a symbol of complacency, rushed development, and corporate overconfidence. Internal GM memos later admitted that the rushed development schedule, just 3 years from concept to production, left insufficient time for testing, engineering validation, and durability improvements. The X-Body platform, designed in a hurry to compete with imports, simply wasn't ready for the mass production scale GM demanded. Despite its failures, the Citation did have one virtue. It forced the U.S. auto industry to pay attention to quality and consumer expectations. Regulators and consumer advocacy groups used its example to push for stricter safety standards, higher durability requirements, and more thorough warranty coverage, all of which became standard in later decades. For GM, it was a bitter lesson in the perils of cutting corners and prioritizing market share over engineering excellence. Today, surviving Citations are rare, and when they do appear, they are often restored as ironic relics of automotive history. Enthusiasts tend to appreciate them not for their performance, reliability, or design, but as a cautionary tale, a car that promised to lead Detroit into the future, but instead revealed the limits of corporate hubris. As one long-suffering owner reflected decades later, "It looked like the future, but it drove like a mistake." Every trip was a reminder that GM had no idea how to build a reliable compact. The 1980 Chevrolet Citation remains a stark symbol of a turning point in American automotive history, a car that could have been revolutionary, but instead reinforced the perception that Detroit had fallen behind. It wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a cultural one, a lesson in hubris, rushed engineering, and the consequences of trying to compete with meticulous foreign competitors while ignoring the fundamentals of quality. In every way, the Citation embodies the decline of the American compact car during the early 1980s, flashy in concept, disastrous in reality.
The 1975 Bricklin SV-1 is one of the most fascinating, tragic, and bizarre chapters in North American automotive history. A car that promised to combine high performance, revolutionary safety, and exotic style, only to crash spectacularly into reality. Conceived by Malcolm Bricklin, a Canadian entrepreneur with more ambition than experience, the SV-1, Safety Vehicle 1, was envisioned as the ultimate safety sports car, a machine that could turn heads, protect its occupants, and prove that North America could compete with European exotics. The car looked like a vision from a sci-fi movie, long, low, wedge-shaped, and covered in gleaming acrylic panels, with dramatic gull-wing doors that seemed lifted from a James Bond set. But the dream of creating a supercar with safety as a selling point collided with the brutal realities of rushed engineering, poor materials, and inadequate mechanical foundations. Malcolm Bricklin launched the SV-1 in 1974 with great fanfare. The car was designed to incorporate a number of safety innovations that were almost unheard of at the time. Impact-absorbing bumpers, energy-absorbing front crumple zones, and seatbelts that were integrated into the structure of the car were touted as revolutionary. The gull-wing doors weren't just for style. They were supposed to reduce the chance of injury in side collisions, allowing occupants to exit safely even in cramped spaces. Bricklin was aiming for the future, a car that looked exotic, drove safely, and stood out from the crowd. He even promised that the SV-1 could compete with European sports cars, providing style and thrill without the compromises of American sedans. Unfortunately, the execution was horrendous from the start. The SV-1's body panels were made of acrylic, a material chosen for its lightness and futuristic look, but it was brittle and prone to cracking. Even minor impacts could shatter the panels, and over time they yellowed or warped in the sun. Paint and finish quality were inconsistent, and many cars left the Canadian production line with noticeable flaws or missing components. The doors, intended to be a highlight, often jammed or wouldn't latch properly, trapping owners inside or leaving them dangling perilously. The engineering and assembly standards were inconsistent, a reflection of the car's rushed and underfunded production. Underneath the flashy exterior, the SV-1 relied on a rather uninspiring AMC-sourced V8 engine, producing around 200 horsepower. While adequate on paper, in a car that weighed nearly 3,000 pounds, it couldn't deliver the supercar performance enthusiasts expected.
Acceleration was sluggish compared to European counterparts like the Ferrari Dino or Porsche 911, and handling suffered from overly soft suspension, body flex, and inconsistent alignment. Owners quickly realized that despite its exotic look, the SV1 drove like a heavy, awkward muscle car, rather than the sleek, nimble sports car advertised. Even the interior left much to be desired. The seats, while comfortable, were basic and poorly finished. Dashboard gauges often rattled, controls were finicky, and quality control was so inconsistent that two cars of the same model year could feel drastically different. Mechanical failures were common, with fuel system issues, brake problems, and electrical quirks plaguing early production models. Production was so rushed and under-resourced that some cars rolled out of the factory unfinished, missing trim pieces, lights, or even essential components of the powertrain. Even though its glaring flaws, the Bricklin SV-1 captured the imagination of the public. Its wedge shape, gull-wing doors, and futuristic styling made it an instant conversation piece. Celebrities and automotive enthusiasts were intrigued by its ambition, and it became a poster car for 1970s optimism, a time when inventors and small entrepreneurs still believed they could disrupt Detroit and Europe with a single brilliant idea. But as more cars hit the road and the defects became apparent, excitement turned to frustration and disappointment. Owners often complained of doors that refused to close, cracked panels, engines that struggled to start, and chassis that flexed unnervingly on turns. Financially, the Bricklin venture was a disaster. Despite selling around 2,850 units in 1975 and another 3,000 or so in 1976, Malcolm Bricklin poured millions into the company and production facilities in St. John, New Brunswick, and could not make the business profitable. Labor disputes, inconsistent quality, and undercapitalization meant that the company teetered on bankruptcy almost from the beginning. By 1976, production had ceased, leaving thousands of owners with exotic-looking cars that were difficult to maintain and expensive to repair. Replacement parts were scarce, mechanics unfamiliar with the car's quirks, and the materials themselves, acrylic panels, gull-wing mechanisms, and AMC components, required constant attention. In retrospect, the Bricklin SV-1 is a cautionary tale of ambition outpacing capability. It was a car that could have been a groundbreaking combination of style, safety, and performance, but the harsh realities of budget, engineering, and manufacturing crushed the dream. And yet, despite its flaws, the SV-1 has become a beloved oddity among collectors. Its rarity, bold design, and place in Canadian automotive history make it a sought-after piece of 1970s experimentation. Enthusiasts often describe owning a Bricklin as a test of patience and ingenuity. You get the style and the story, but you also get the headaches, the leaks, and the quirkiness that no European car would tolerate. The 1975 Bricklin SV-1 is ultimately remembered not as a supercar, but as a symbol of the era. Audacious, unconventional, and disastrously executed. It was a car that tried to be revolutionary, safe, and exotic all at once, and, in failing, it became unforgettable. Its gull-wing doors may jam, its panels may crack, and its engine may wheeze, but every Bricklin still carries the dream of a Canadian engineer daring to defy the automotive world, no matter how messy the result.
The 1981 DeLorean DMC-12 is one of the most notorious examples of style triumphing over substance in automotive history. A car that has become immortalized in pop culture, yet in its own time was a technical and commercial disaster. Conceived by John DeLorean, a flamboyant former GM executive with a taste for risk and showmanship, the DMC-12 was intended to be a revolutionary sports car, futuristic in design, exotic in engineering, and instantly recognizable from every angle. With its brushed stainless steel body, gull-wing doors, and wedge-shaped silhouette, it looked like a spaceship on wheels, a vision of 1980s optimism. But behind the dazzling exterior lurked a litany of compromises, design flaws, and production woes that doomed the car almost from day one. The DeLorean's design was undeniably striking. Its stainless steel body panels required no paint and gave the car a permanent, shimmering presence. The gull-wing doors, intended to evoke science fiction elegance, were engineered to reduce side impact risks and create drama at every entry. Underneath, the DMC-12 relied on a chassis and suspension layout designed by Lotus, giving it reasonably sporty handling on paper. Yet, despite its futuristic promise, the reality of owning a DeLorean was far less glamorous. At launch, the car was powered by a modest 2.85-liter V6 engine, producing just 130 horsepower, a painfully low figure for a car that weighed over 2,700 pounds. Acceleration was lethargic, with 0 to 60 miles per hour times exceeding 10 seconds, and top speed was underwhelming compared to similarly priced European sports cars. Steering and suspension, though tuned for sporty handling, were compromised by the car's weight distribution and high center of gravity, making the DMC-12 feel ponderous and unpredictable at the limits. Owners who expected exotic performance were often shocked to find themselves outpaced by ordinary cars in stoplight sprints. Mechanically, the DMC-12 suffered from chronic reliability issues. The V6 was underpowered and temperamental, prone to overheating and difficult maintenance. Early cars leaked oil, had electrical gremlins, and experienced chronic problems with the stainless steel body panels, which were impossible to repair without specialized tools and techniques. Minor dents or scratches couldn't be fixed by ordinary body shops. Most repairs required carefully polishing or replacing entire panels, making upkeep expensive and frustrating. The gull-wing doors, while iconic, were a constant source of headaches, often binding in hot weather or misaligning over time, occasionally trapping passengers inside the car. Production at the DeLorean Motor Company's factory in Northern Ireland compounded the problems. The company was underfunded, inexperienced, and rushed. Quality control was inconsistent, with many cars leaving the factory with unfinished interiors, poorly aligned panels, or missing trim. Labor strikes and political unrest in Northern Ireland further disrupted production, limiting output and increasing costs. The resulting cars were expensive, unreliable, and far from the flawless vision John DeLorean had promised investors and buyers. Financially, the DMC-12 was a disaster from the start. It sold for around $25,000, a huge sum for the early 1980s, and despite its futuristic appearance, it failed to deliver the performance or reliability buyers expected. John DeLorean's aggressive marketing and celebrity connections initially generated excitement, but the car's shortcomings quickly became apparent. Buyers who expected a European-level exotic found themselves with a flashy but slow and mechanically finicky machine. The DeLorean's fate was further sealed by scandal. In 1982, John DeLorean was arrested in a highly publicized cocaine trafficking sting, though he was later acquitted. The company, already on shaky financial footing, collapsed, leaving thousands of buyers with expensive, exotic cars that would soon lose value. Without corporate support, replacement parts and maintenance became difficult, making ownership a lifelong challenge for anyone trying to keep a DMC-12 on the road. Despite all of this, the DeLorean DMC-12 became a pop culture phenomenon, thanks largely to its starring role in the Back to the Future film trilogy. In the movies, the car's gull-wing doors and futuristic design made it the perfect visual icon of time travel and imagination. This Hollywood magic transformed the DMC-12 into a collector's item, admired more for nostalgia and cinematic fame than engineering excellence. Enthusiasts today cherish them as conversation pieces, but even the most devoted fans acknowledge the car's flaws. It is slow, heavy, fragile, and expensive to maintain. In retrospect, the DeLorean DMC-12 is a study in ambition, design obsession, and the limits of vision without execution.
John DeLorean's dream was bold and unforgettable, but the reality was a car that underperformed mechanically, suffered from chronic reliability issues, and carried a price tag far above its value. Its stainless steel body and gull-wing doors are still celebrated for their daring and audacity, but for owners in the early 1980s, the DMC-12 was a daily headache disguised as a masterpiece. It remains, above all, a cautionary tale. Even the flashiest ideas cannot survive without sound engineering, realistic planning, and a stable foundation. The DeLorean DMC-12 lives on in memory and film, remembered fondly for its style and story, but rarely for its performance or practicality.